In the heart of the Simeon Mountains, Ethiopia, Kamaria's eyes flutter open, her head pounding as she tries to move. Panic grips her when she realizes she's tied to a tree, her wrists bound tightly. The air is cold, the towering trees casting eerie shadows under the moonlight. Then she hears it, a long, haunting howl in the distance, followed by others joining in. Wolves. Her heart races, and she struggles against the ropes, her breath coming in short gasps. Something crinkles against her chest. Looking down, she sees a note pinned to her tattered dress. With trembling fingers, she reads the cruel words. You were never wanted. Survive if you can. A lump forms in her throat, and for a moment, tears spill down her cheeks. But then something shifts inside her. Fear fades, replaced by a fire deep within. She will not let them win. She will not die here. Kamaria had always felt like an outsider in her own home. Ever since her father died, the warmth and love she once knew disappeared, replaced by the cold cruelty of her stepmother, Ayoka. At first, it was small things, the dismissive glares, the sharp tone in her voice, the way she sighed whenever Kamaria entered the room. But as time passed, the hatred grew. Ayoka no longer hid her disgust. She treated Kamaria like a burden, like an insect she couldn't wait to crush. The house that was once filled with laughter became a prison. Ayoka made sure Kamaria was always busy, scrubbing floors until her hands bled, cooking meals she wasn't allowed to eat, and fetching water from the river while her stepmother and stepsisters lounged in luxury. Her inheritance, the wealth her father had left behind, was stolen before she could even claim it. Ayoka used it to dress herself in the finest clothes, to throw lavish parties, to live a life Kamaria was meant to have. Every time Kamaria dared to speak up, a slap or a sharp pull of her hair reminded her of her place. But Ayoka wasn't satisfied with simply making Kamaria suffer. As long as the girl was alive, she was a threat, a reminder of the man she once pretended to love, a loose end, and Ayoka never left loose ends. One evening, Ayoka called Kamaria into her chamber with an unusual smile. She told her she had arranged a special trip, a chance for Kamaria to escape the dullness of home and experience something exciting. Suspicious, but desperate for any moment of kindness, Kamaria hesitated. Ayoka's voice was sweet, too sweet, like honey hiding poison. But when she saw the carriage waiting outside, she wanted to believe. Maybe, just maybe, this was real. Maybe Ayoka was finally giving her a chance to be free, even if just for a little while. The ride started peacefully, the rhythmic movement of the carriage lulling Kamaria into a rare sense of calm. But then, a strange dizziness washed over her. Her limbs grew heavy, her vision blurred, and she struggled to keep her eyes open. The last thing she saw was Ayoka's cold smile as the world faded to black. When Kamaria woke up, she was no longer in the carriage. The soft cushions were gone, replaced by rough bark against her back. Her hands and feet were bound tightly, the rope biting into her skin. Darkness surrounded her, the only light coming from the pale moon above. A chilling breeze made her shiver, and then she heard it. The howls, long, eerie cries that sent a shudder through her bones. Wolves. She tried to move, but the ropes held her still. Panic surged through her chest. Then she noticed something pinned to her chest. With trembling fingers, she managed to pull the note free. Even in the dim light, the words were clear. You were never wanted. Survive if you can. Kamaria's heart pounded as the weight of the words crushed her. Ayoka had done this. She had stolen everything, taken away Kamaria's home, and now she had left her here to die. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them back. Crying wouldn't save her. Fear wouldn't save her. Only she could save herself now. The wind rustled the trees, and the howls grew closer. Shadows moved between the trees, yellow eyes flashing in the darkness. The wolves had found her. Her breath caught in her throat as she braced herself for the worst. But deep inside, something awakened, a fire, a determination stronger than she had ever felt before. She would not let Ayoka win. She would not die here. The ropes had burned her wrists raw, but Kamaria had managed to free herself before the wolves could find her. The moment her hands were loose, she ran. She didn't think, didn't stop to look back. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between her and the spot where Ayoka had abandoned her. The night was deep, the trees stretching endlessly in every direction, their twisted branches reaching for her like clawed fingers. Cold air bit at her skin, and the ground beneath her bare feet was rough with sharp stones and tangled roots. Every step sent pain shooting up her legs, but she didn't slow down. The darkness was alive with movement. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a shiver through her spine. She was not alone. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but fear was stronger. The silence of the forest was unnatural, broken only by the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. Then, a sound made her freeze. A rustling in the bushes, soft but deliberate. Someone or something was moving nearby. She held her breath, listening, heart pounding so loudly she thought it might betray her hiding place. Another rustle, this time closer. Then, a low growl. She turned slowly, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Yellow eyes blinked at her from the shadows. One pair at first, then another, and another. They were everywhere, circling her, moving with deadly grace through the undergrowth. The Ethiopian wolves had found her. Their fur, a blend of russet and grey, made them blend into the darkness, but their glowing eyes betrayed them. Kamaria took a step back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body refused to move. Running would do nothing. They were faster, stronger. There was no escape. The largest wolf stepped forward, its muscles rippling beneath its thick coat. It bared its teeth, lips curling back in a silent warning. Kamaria swallowed hard. Every survival instinct in her body told her she was about to die. The wolves closed in, forming a circle, their sharp teeth flashing in the moonlight. One step closer, and they would pounce. Kamaria clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. If this was the end, she would face it with her eyes open. She would not scream. She would not beg. She lifted her chin, meeting the gaze of the lead wolf. The beast stared back, its golden eyes piercing into hers, searching for something. Kamaria held her breath. The air between them was thick with tension, the weight of life and death balancing on a knife's edge. Then, something changed. The growling softened. The wolves hesitated. The leader took another step forward, but this time, it did not attack. Instead, it sniffed the air, its ears twitching as if considering. Kamaria's heart pounded. Was this a trick? Were they toying with her before the kill? The leader lowered its head slightly, eyes still locked onto hers. Then, it did something Kamaria never expected. It nudged her. Not a vicious attack, not a lunge, but a slow, deliberate push against her leg. The other wolves shifted, their growls fading into curious whines. Kamaria stood frozen, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. These creatures, these wild hunters, had every reason to kill her. She was weak, lost, easy prey, and yet they did not strike. They did not rip her apart. Instead, they watched her, waiting. Kamaria's fear did not disappear, but something else flickered in its place, a sliver of hope. She took a shaky breath, her muscles still tense, ready to flee if the wolves changed their minds. But for now, they did not attack. For now, she was still breathing. Kamaria barely breathed as the wolves circled her, their golden eyes glowing in the dark. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, but she knew that would be useless. They were faster, stronger, and this was their territory. If they wanted her dead, she wouldn't stand a chance. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay still, to meet their gaze without flinching. She had no weapons, no strength left to fight, but she refused to die cowering. The largest wolf, a massive black beast with piercing yellow eyes, stepped forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with power. The other wolves backed away slightly, giving their leader space. Kamaria swallowed hard, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. This was it, the moment before the end. The wolf lowered its head, sniffing the air between them. Then, to her shock, it took another step closer, not with aggression, but with something else. Curiosity. Kamaria held her breath as the wolf leaned in, its cold nose brushing against her arm. The contact sent a shiver through her body. It could rip her apart in seconds, but instead, it nudged her, gently. She blinked in confusion. What was happening? The wolf pulled back, tilting its head as if studying her. The rest of the pack stood silent, watching. There was no growling now, no bared teeth. The tension in the air shifted. Kamaria slowly lowered herself onto her knees, her hands pressing into the damp earth. If they saw her as a threat, maybe this would show them she wasn't. The black wolf took another step forward, sniffing her hair, her shoulder. Then, without warning, it let out a soft huff and turned away. The others hesitated for a moment before following. Kamaria remained frozen, not sure if this was a trick, if they were testing her before striking. But as she watched, the pack moved together, their bodies flowing like shadows through the trees. The leader stopped and looked back at her, waiting. Kamaria's mind raced. Were they inviting her to follow? That didn't make sense. Wolves didn't accept humans into their world. She was an outsider, a stranger. But then, what choice did she have? Alone, she wouldn't last long in the wilderness. If the wolves had spared her, maybe they knew something she didn't. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed herself to her feet. The black wolf huffed again, turning to lead the way. The others moved with it, their sleek bodies blending into the darkness. Kamaria took a shaky breath and stepped forward. The night swallowed them as they moved through the dense forest. Kamaria stayed at the back of the pack, unsure if she was truly welcome or merely being tolerated. The wolves moved like ghosts, their paws silent against the forest floor. They knew this land, understood its dangers in a way she never could. She followed as best she could, stumbling over roots and ducking beneath low branches. The pack never slowed, but neither did they leave her behind. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Kamaria's body ached, exhaustion creeping into her bones, but she kept moving. Then, the wolves stopped. The black wolf lifted its head, ears twitching, listening to something Kamaria couldn't hear. A moment later, the others followed suit, their bodies going still. Kamaria felt her pulse quicken. Was something coming? A new threat? She stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. The leader moved again, but this time at a slower pace, leading them toward a break in the trees. Kamaria followed, heart pounding, until they reached a clearing. A small stream trickled through the grass, the water clear and cool beneath the moonlight. The wolves stepped forward, drinking from the stream, their tense bodies relaxing. Kamaria hesitated, watching them. Were they showing her where to drink? She licked her cracked lips, her throat burning with thirst. Slowly, she approached the stream and knelt beside it. The wolves barely glanced at her as she cupped the cold water in her hands, bringing it to her mouth. Relief washed over her as the cool liquid soothed her parched throat. She drank greedily, ignoring the way her hands trembled. When she finally stopped, she looked up to find the black wolf staring at her again. There was something in its gaze she couldn't understand. Not hostility, not hunger, something else. Kamaria sat back, the weight of exhaustion heavy on her shoulders. The wolves curled up around the clearing, their bodies pressing into one another for warmth. She watched them, fascinated by how at ease they were. For creatures so deadly they seemed almost peaceful. The black wolf remained standing, watching her for a long moment before finally settling down. Kamaria hesitated, unsure of what she was supposed to do. She was not a wolf, not one of them, and yet she was still here. They had accepted her presence, at least for now. Carefully, she pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around herself. The night air was cold, but she didn't dare move closer to the wolves. She would not push her luck. Instead, she closed her eyes, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and beneath it all, the steady breathing of the pack. She was still alive. The thought settled deep in her mind, a small ember of hope flickering to life. Ayoka had left her here to die, but she had not died. She had faced the wolves, stood before them, and somehow they had let her live. Perhaps they had seen something in her. Perhaps she had been wrong about them. Kamaria opened her eyes, staring at the black wolf one last time before allowing herself to rest. She was still alone in many ways, but for now, in this moment, she was not abandoned, not completely. Kamaria had lost track of how many days had passed since she started following the wolves. The forest no longer felt like a death trap, but something she was beginning to understand. The wolves had become her guides, showing her where to find water, teaching her how to move through the wilderness without making a sound. She learned to recognize danger the way they did, to listen to the silence before a predator struck, to smell the shift in the wind before a storm rolled in. Each day she felt herself growing stronger, no longer the helpless girl left to die in the wild. She still didn't know why the wolves had spared her. They didn't treat her like an enemy, but they didn't treat her like one of their own either. She was something in between, a stranger in their world, but not unwelcome. They let her walk with them, hunt with them. She watched how they worked together, how they communicated without words. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, and somehow she had become part of it. Then, one morning, everything changed. The black wolf, the leader of the pack, set a new pace, moving through the trees with a purpose. The others followed without hesitation, and Kamaria, without thinking, followed too. The deeper they went, the thicker the trees became, until the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. The air felt different here, heavier, as if the land itself held secrets. Kamaria's heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. Then she saw it, a cave, its entrance half hidden behind a wall of vines. The wolves moved toward it without hesitation. Kamaria hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The air was cool, damp, carrying the scent of earth and stone. The darkness swallowed her, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw something that made her breath catch. The walls shimmered. At first, she thought it was just the way the light from outside reflected against the stone. But as she moved closer, she realized the truth. The walls were laced with veins of gold, thick, unbroken veins that stretched deep into the cave. She reached out, running her fingers along the surface. It was real, a hidden gold mine, untouched, forgotten. Her mind raced. This could change everything. She had been thrown away, left to die, but now she held the key to something powerful. If she could find a way out of this wilderness, if she could return with the knowledge of this place, she wouldn't just survive, she would rise, rich, untouchable. No one would ever look down on her again. Not Ayoka, not anyone. But her moment of wonder was short-lived. The wolves suddenly tensed. The black wolf let out a low growl, its ears flicking toward the cave entrance. Kamaria turned sharply, her pulse quickening. Someone was outside. She pressed herself against the cave wall, trying to control her breathing. The wolves moved as one, their bodies lowering into a stance she had come to recognize, ready to attack. Footsteps crunched against the gravel outside. Slow, careful. Someone was approaching. Kamaria's hands clenched into fists. She had spent days in this wilderness, thinking she was alone, but she wasn't. And now, she wasn't the only one who knew about the gold. The forest was eerily silent as Ayoka and her men arrived at the entrance of the hidden cave. The journey had been brutal, with thick vines cutting at their skin and unseen eyes watching their every step. The mercenaries grumbled, uneasy in the wilderness, but Ayoka kept them moving. She could almost taste the gold waiting inside. Then she saw her. Kamaria stood at the mouth of the cave, her posture strong, her face unreadable. She was no longer the weak, helpless girl Ayoka had left to die. There was something different about her now, something unbreakable. Ayoka's lips curled into a sneer. "Step aside, Kamaria. That cave does not belong to you." Kamaria's eyes burned with defiance. "And it does not belong to you." Her voice was calm, steady. "You left me to die. This is not yours." Ayoka's fingers twitched. She had not come all this way for an argument. She had come for what was hers. With a smirk, she turned to the mercenaries and gave a small nod. "Then you die here for real." The men stepped forward, weapons in hand. Kamaria did not move, her heartbeat steady. She had no weapons, no armor, just herself and the wolves. Before the mercenaries could take another step, a low growl rumbled through the trees. Then another, and another. The forest came alive with movement as shadows emerged from the undergrowth. Yellow eyes gleamed in the dim light. The pack had arrived. The massive black wolf, Ayoka, the leader, stood at Kamaria's side, his fur bristling. He let out a deep, guttural snarl that sent a wave of fear through the armed men. The mercenaries hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. They were hunters, killers. But this was something else. Then, the wolves attacked. The forest exploded into chaos. Teeth sank into flesh. Claws tore through fabric and skin. The mercenaries screamed, swinging their weapons wildly. But the wolves were too fast, too coordinated. One by one, the men fell, their courage crumbling like dry leaves in the wind. Panic spread like wildfire. Some of the mercenaries turned and ran, disappearing into the dense jungle. Others weren't so lucky. Within minutes, the attack was over. The remaining men had fled, their greed no match for their fear. Ayoka was alone. She stood frozen, her breath ragged, her body trembling. The realization hit her like a stone. Her men were gone. The wolves had won, and Kamaria was still standing, untouched, surrounded by the very creatures that should have devoured her long ago. Ayoka's legs buckled, and she fell to her knees. She looked up at Kamaria, her once mocking eyes now filled with something she had never shown before. "Fear. Please," she whispered. "Spare me." Kamaria stepped forward, her gaze cold and unwavering. For years, this woman had stolen from her, broken her, discarded her like she was nothing. Now, Ayoka knelt before her, powerless. For a long moment, Kamaria said nothing. Then, with quiet strength, she turned away. She did not need to raise a hand against Ayoka. The wolves had already passed their judgment, and the wilderness had a way of taking care of those who did not belong. Ayoka lay in the dirt, gasping for breath, her once proud face streaked with sweat and dust. The woman who had spent years tormenting Kamaria, treating her like nothing more than a burden, was now the one begging for her life. Her voice, usually sharp with cruelty, was weak and desperate. "Please," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. "You don't have to do this." Kamaria stood tall, her body hardened by the trials of the wilderness, her heart steady with the weight of her decision. The wolves circled them, their golden eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, their low growls humming through the trees. Nyoka, the black alpha, stood closest to Kamaria, waiting for a command. One word, one signal, and Ayoka's fate would be sealed. But Kamaria didn't need revenge. She had already won. She turned away without a word. The decision was made. Ayoka had left her to die, and now she would know what it felt like to be abandoned, to face the darkness alone. Kamaria did not need to stain her hands with vengeance. The wilderness would decide Ayoka's fate, just as it had once tested Kamaria's own strength. With her wolves at her side, Kamaria walked away, leaving her stepmother frozen in shock, her pleas fading into the night. The moment Kamaria disappeared into the shadows of the trees, she knew there was no turning back. She had closed that chapter of her life. For days, Kamaria traveled with the pack, moving through the mountains with ease. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled through the darkness, lost and desperate. She had become something else, something stronger. She understood the land now. She knew where to find water, how to read the sky for coming storms, how to move silently through the brush without alerting prey or predator. She was not merely surviving, she was thriving. But the wilderness was not her home. She had unfinished business in the world beyond the trees, and she would not let the past control her future. The time had come to return. When she finally emerged from the mountains and stepped into the outskirts of the village, the people barely recognized her. She was no longer the girl they had pitied, the girl who had been cast aside. She moved with a quiet confidence, her gaze sharp and unwavering. The wolves at her side sent a ripple of fear and awe through the crowd. The whispers began immediately. "She's alive? She was supposed to be dead. What happened to her?" Kamaria ignored them. She had no time for their questions, no patience for their gossip. She walked with purpose through the market, her destination clear. She arrived at what was once her father's home, her home, but it was no longer the grand house she remembered. It had been stripped of its beauty, left to decay under Ayoka's rule. The gardens were overgrown, the walls dull and cracked. It was a reflection of what had happened in her absence. Ayoka had bled the estate dry, taking everything for herself while leaving nothing behind. But Kamaria would restore what was lost. With the wealth of the hidden gold mine, she rebuilt her father's legacy. She did not hoard the treasure as Ayoka would have. She used it to create opportunities for the people who had suffered under her stepmother's greed. She reopened her father's businesses, ensuring fair wages for the workers. She funded schools, making sure children would have the education she had nearly been denied. She proved that strength was not about taking, it was about building. Word spread far and wide. The girl who had been left for dead had returned, not just to reclaim what was hers, but to uplift those who had been cast aside just as she had. The people respected her, not because of her wealth, but because of her resilience. They saw the fire in her eyes, the unwavering determination in her actions. She had faced the worst and had come back stronger. But what of Ayoka? No one knew what became of her. Some whispered that she had been devoured by the wolves, that the wilderness had swallowed her whole as punishment for her wickedness. Others claimed she had been seen wandering the mountains, a ghost of her former self, searching for the power she had lost. Kamaria never looked for her. She never needed to. Her stepmother was the past. Kamaria had moved beyond that. Now, she was not just a survivor. She was a leader. She had forged her own destiny, shaped not by cruelty, but by strength, resilience, and the lessons the wilderness had taught her. And the wolves, they never left her. They remained at her side, silent guardians, protectors of the girl who had become their own. Together, they stood as a reminder of what true power was. Not the gold, not the wealth, not the fleeting illusion of control. True power was unbreakable spirit. Kamaria had been left to die, but she had risen, and no one would ever take that from her again. Strength isn't given, it's earned. Greed destroys, but resilience builds. A true leader isn't chosen, they rise. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to watch the next video. You won't want to miss what happens next.